Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Propagandacast. Lehr with me, your host, Imperial Dane, Master of Instruction. We are off here to talk about artillery theory, some of the basics behind artillery, and some of the more basic artillery tactics in game. Artillery encompassing basically anything that fires like artillery. We talk foxes, howitzers, rocket artillery, mortars, field guns that can also barrage, basically all that. I mean, this is artillery, or the rather light artillery, and of course this is also artillery, just in the very, very heavy end of things. And of course there are some basic understandings of artillery, something like, for example, they scatter depending on, length. I mean, for example, one shot goes, you, for example, say, I want to barrage this area, then of course you'll have a chance to sort of hit around, say, that area, might, miss the target, or, hit the target. But there are other things then further play into this, to this scatter. And these things are, for example, can you actually see the target? I mean, there's actually going to be a noticeable difference to scatter depending on, can you see the target or can't you? I mean, if it's in fog of war, for example, compared to here, there's going to be a lot more scatter on the shot, so the shell is much more likely to basically hit something else, which, might be less what you're looking for. That is one thing, though there's another one, a much more also important factor playing it, and that is range. That is, the further away the target is, and for example, this can fire all the way to India. I mean, the larger scatter there is. I mean, compared to, for example, here, where it's likely going to be hitting with pinpoint accuracy, at least close to it. I mean, over here, it's going to be a lot harder for it to sort of hit the target. In particular, since right in this case, we can't even see. This was something that was also in Company of Heroes, but in Company 2, it's sort of further in there, so that's something to keep in mind. For things like, shells, artillery, for example, I mean, it might not play such a role, and for example, for mortars, again, I mean, generally, they are much closer to the front line. Of course, generally they're operating within line of sight. So of course, I mean, they tend to be less effective, but even then, it makes a difference if they can actually bloody well see the target, for example. And, that's not too far away of them. But then again, they can also place themselves behind a lot of things, practically standing right next to it without being seen. And again, in that department, that's a good little extra tactic there to sort of getting the most out of your mortars. So already there's sort of things that can sort of determine how accurate your artillery fire actually will be. And for example, rocket artillery, which we don't quite have anything on, but there's something on the way. I mean, really in particular, need to be close because, again, due to the big rocket artillery is always about volume. So the closer you can actually get your rocket artillery without getting it blown up, generally the more effective it will have compared to if you're blasting away from the farthest point possible, which is probably not going to be hitting an awful lot. Other factors, of course, include veterancy, which again, veterancy 2 generally tends to make all artillery pretty much more accurate and less likely to, scatter all over the place. So, another little fun fact there. Not a huge one, but again, not the primary one. Again, we were looking at range and fog of war. Let's see if we can get this thing to fire. Of course, then you might discuss then, well, how can you employ artillery? I mean, there's numerous ways. Of course, we've got this one here, which is the let's fire the artillery straight at what we can actually see, the opposing bastards. And again, note here, I mean, he was probably aiming for one of them tanks, but rather flew here, so again, even that little bit of range can make a difference. But right here, I mean, this is one of the more simple ways. Again, that's just basically shooting at what you can see, and more or less, I would call it direct fire, but pretty much just fire at a target. That's probably pretty much one of the most simplest artillery tactics there is in the game. Again, you see an opponent, you want them dead, you fire the artillery at it. End of story. Pretty much the most basic one, but it's not always the one that's going to be utilized because, you don't necessarily always have the opponent. Sometimes, you want to soften things up or just want to harass them. And of course, that's where sort of a lot of novices then proceed to sort of make a sort of, well, shall we say, basic mistake. They just begin firing randomly and hoping the opponents. Then, of course, there might be an enemy. He might be around here, but then he might not. I mean, generally, if you're going to be firing artillery into the fog of war, generally I know called blind fire. And again, that's what I probably call what most of the novices end up doing with artillery, in particular with Katyusha rockets, which aren't really good at that kind of thing, hoping to catch something. I mean, shooting and praying to hit your opponent is not necessarily the most efficient of tactics, and certainly something I imagine many an artilleryman would scoff at. I might even be able to question one, but that's another matter of the story. Rather than there are some sort of tactics and there's sort of try out sort of, how large a chance of hitting. For example, on the map of Moscow, in fact, this is why I chose this one, there's generally always something you can do, and we can call that interdiction fire. This, you're hoping to catch the bastards on the move. And you might be wondering, well, where's the good route? Again, generally on a map, and once you get a sort of feel out, there's always going to be a place where, for example, your opponent's more likely to go and move out from. And for Moscow, again, this is really typified by, this area and this area. Interdiction fire is basically hammering these areas with artillery, making it much harder for your opponent to move in a straight line, or at least the shortest route from here to there, to the front line, to support his troops and other measures. It also means you're more likely to just catch someone on the move, and also catch retreating units. That is one sort of, of the more common ways of utilizing it by certain more clever players. So, for example, again, alright, my opponent moves through this area pretty often. I should probably be shooting in that rather than that large swath of terrain where I know he might be hiding something, but I don't know. And that way, catch something. So that, for example, is one way of sort of getting a bit more out of your artillery. Otherwise, if you know he's a static position, you can blast merrily away at that. But of course, that is not all. I mean, again, in harassment fire, you can sort of hope, but again, if you're, for example, going to be using rocket artillery, try to get close, but otherwise, again, try to have an idea of, where it is. And certainly, it's not a bad idea, for example, if you say have a commander with, say, area reconnaissance, to then sort of, get an idea where the opponent is, thus also getting line of sight bonus, and then plastering it with more rockets, shells, and mortar bombs than you could ever possibly conceive. Then you might also basically say use your artillery to block off an area. Again, we'll just take these narrow streets as an example. We say we have the mortar here. There's likelihood he's coming through here. You don't want him to because there's something, gone. So you begin to just bombard the area. You pretty much go to him, well, you're not going to be moving free, and if you are, it's going to hurt. That's basically blockade fire, if you will, Sperrfeuer. That way, again, you can sort of deny an area, at least temporarily, to your opponent and force him to either take a longer route, go through here, or just wait. Again, you might need to buy yourself time. It can also, for example, be used sort of quickly to, say, cover units as pulling back, fire some artillery, hoping to, dissuade the pursuers from continuing their pursuit unless they fancy a face full of rocket or high explosive shell. I mean, already with that, we're sort of getting some ideas, how artillery can be utilized. Again, there's actually a lot of ways to get something out of your artillery. Quite a few. I mean, that's always something to keep in mind. And of course, mortars are currently the more common one, and again, they generally don't suffer as much, and for them, of course, it's just always a good idea to just, most of the time, just have them fire on their own. That, of course, is a little fun thing there to keep in mind. And there you go, the Katyusha rocket truck arrives. Sadly, I can't show anything about range of scatter here, but And of course, as a rule of thumb, you want it to be reasonably close to your opponent, sort of get off the least scatter, and again, concentrate the rockets on a small area. Same applies to the Panzerwerfer, but then again, it slightly has a better chance because it fires all rockets at the same time. Katyusha, on the other hand, fires them in volley, so there's a bit of a difference there. On the other hand, a sustained volley in the right place can probably end up doing more damage if you pull it off correctly. And of course, you have direct fire, which is more for, there's a particular target you really want gone, and it's not like you're going to move right away. So, I mean, then you can, for example, use that either on the howitzer, Katyusha, or mortar. If you're playing as a surge with the Germans, there's counter-artillery, and for that, I mean, there's not really much of a purpose on this, the Panzerwerfer, otherwise I currently would not suggest using it. And of course, there's another thing, counter-artillery, the art of shooting at the opponent's artillery, which of course means generally once the other bastard has some artillery, begin moving around your own. If you have, for example, mortars, it's not a bad idea to, for example, shift them around from time to time to try and avoid counter-artillery fire from your opponent, because it's most likely your opponent will try and kill your artillery. Katyushas and Panzerwerfer are more or less the same rule. Once there's a chance they might get shot back at, the rule you adopt is basically you fire, barrage, then you shift positions, generally a bit further away, so you can sort of avoid getting hit with artillery in return. Things like that can then further extend the life of your own artillery. And of course, for your opponent, I mean, or you wanting to counter artillery, the rule is basically as soon as you see it, you begin firing in the general direction, hoping to catch it. Of course, some weapons will be markedly better than others. I mean, for example, like Katyusha at far range is probably not going to be the best counter-artillery weapon. Never will be. On the other hand, a B4 on the other hand could probably pull it off quite well, or a howitzer. So all these little things, add up in the longer run, giving you sort of, set of tools to actually, utilize for the artillery. So again, spotting for it, and of course, also trying to do the best, to ensure you don't fire at a target far away on the actually clear side. I mean, you can sort of get more out of your artillery, and again, deciding, when should I use my artillery instead of just blindly firing at your opponent. Because again, I mean, I've seen countless games where someone was firing, for example, like a Katyusha for tens of minutes, and they only got one kill because again they just kept firing blindly. So as a general rule of thumb, you should try and avoid blind fire if possible, because generally it's the least accurate and the least one actually about to cure anything. Again, generally, even if you can't see it, at least try to make sure somehow beforehand there's something there. If you can, you will more likely actually succeed with the artillery and actually have a bit more fun with it, and overall get a lot more mileage out of it, be it Katyusha, Panzerwerfer, Howitzer or Mortar. So for example, some of those things, blockade fire, harassment fire, interdiction fire, more or less the same thing I suppose. Of course, you can also find another favourite tactic is, since generally from having played on both sides, you'll usually know where the headquarters is, and of course you have it in range. I mean, a common tactic is actually bombard around the headquarters, hoping to catch some units there. And it was a particular fond one in the Company of Heroes. Generally, the way to avoid that is always then you actually move your units away from the headquarters towards other buildings in your base, maybe having some built farther away from everything else so that you can reinforce there. Another little tip there to sort of avoid that kind of fire. Otherwise, again, try as always possible to shoot at your opponent where you actually know he is and can actually see him, because generally you're more likely to actually get a hit on him. Good artillery usage can overall lead you to actually landing some devastating hits. Poor artillery usage will just lead you to a waste of resources, in particular if it's, say, a Katyusha and you're just firing madly at the opponent in the hopes that some god may benevolently look upon you and actually land a rocket upon them. You're probably not going to succeed, and compared to if you actually use proper artillery tactics, proper artillery theory, and figure out, where's the best way of landing something on my opponent's head, which he will not like. So, hopefully after this little brief lecture, people have gained a slightly higher understanding of artillery. For those that were a bit perplexed by it, why they never quite got all of those juicy kills in their opponent. Again, if possible, have a reasonable distance, but at the same time also keep within reasonable distance of your opponent. If you can see them, even better. And of course, try to sort of think about how you want to use your artillery, because again, it can actually be used in many ways. Even if you necessarily can't see them and can't hit them, you can always sort of try and make it harder for them to move about. And for example, that's for example where the regular howitzers are actually quite good, particularly the German howitzer, which keeps shooting for some time. That can actually be quite useful in actually denying an area for some time. Little tip there. So hopefully you've learned something. Hopefully you gained some understanding on artillery. If you did, why not subscribe, tell your friends, share with everyone, If not, feel free to let me know what kind of topic you'd like to see covered in the comments. This is Imperial Dane saying cheers.